You are kneeling on a white cloth, and in front of you is a short blade you were handed only moments ago. This is not how you imagined your life ending. You imagined a battlefield, a sword in your hand, an enemy in front of you, something you could fight against. Instead, your lord has been disgraced, your side has lost, and the code you spent your entire life training to uphold now demands one final act of discipline, a calm, controlled death, performed correctly, in front of witnesses, because how you die matters just as much as how you lived. Japan, sometime between the 12th and 19th centuries. You've heard the word people will use to describe you for centuries afterward, samurai. It sounds like honor, discipline, mastery of the sword. Nobody mentioned that for much of your life, you'd spend more time doing paperwork than fighting, more time worrying about your family's shrinking rice stipend than about glorious battle, and that the very code of honor you lived by could, in the end, be the exact thing that killed you. This is your life as a samurai, one of history's most romanticized identities, and one whose real daily existence looked almost nothing like the legend. You didn't decide to become a samurai any more than a medieval European noble's son decided to become a knight. If you were born into a samurai family, this identity, and the training that came with it, began shaping you almost from birth. Historical accounts of samurai upbringing describe a childhood built around discipline from an extremely early age. Formal education in reading, writing, and Confucian ethics was paired with physical training in swordsmanship, archery, and, depending on the era and region, spear fighting and horsemanship. This wasn't optional character building. It was preparation for a specific social role you were born into and expected to fulfill, with your family's honor and standing directly tied to how well you performed it. Your training centered heavily on the katana and its companion blade. But here's a detail that surprises people who assume constant sword duels. For much of the samurai class's actual history, especially during the roughly 2.5 centuries of relative peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, real combat with live blades was something most samurai rarely, if ever, experienced firsthand. Sword training continued as a matter of discipline, tradition, and readiness, but readiness for a war that, for long stretches of Japanese history, simply didn't come. Archery held genuine prestige in earlier periods, and mounted combat with bow and arrow was, for centuries before firearms became widespread, considered a defining warrior skill, arguably more central to early samurai identity than the sword itself, despite what later popular imagination emphasizes. When Portuguese traders introduced matchlock firearms to Japan in the 16th century, Japanese blacksmiths and gunsmiths rapidly adapted and mass-produced them, and firearms genuinely transformed battlefield tactics during the Sengoku period's large-scale conflicts. A detail that complicates the popular image of samurai warfare as purely sword-and-bow combat, since gunpowder weapons became a serious, widely adopted part of the actual military picture. Your social position came with a formal hierarchy and genuinely strict codes of conduct governing nearly every aspect of daily life. How you dressed, who you could marry, how you addressed people of different rank, and what weapons you were permitted to carry, since carrying swords was, by law during much of the Edo period, a privilege legally restricted specifically to the samurai class. This legal privilege, historians note, functioned as much as a visible marker of social status separating you from farmers, merchants, and artisans as it did a practical weapon for combat you might rarely, if ever, actually use. Here's the detail that reshapes almost everyone's picture of samurai life once they learn real Japanese history. For a very large portion of the samurai class's existence, particularly during the long Tokugawa peace beginning in the early 17th century, your actual day-to-day work looked far more like that of a government bureaucrat than a warrior. With large-scale warfare largely absent for roughly 250 years, the shogunate needed its samurai class to serve functional administrative roles as officials, tax collectors, record keepers, and local administrators. in order to justify their continued stipends and social position. Historical records from this period describe samurai spending considerable time on administrative duties, financial record-keeping, and bureaucratic responsibilities within their domain's government structure. A genuinely significant departure from the battlefield-focused warrior identity popular culture tends to project onto the entire samurai era. This shift
The koku
created
amount
a real,
is fixed.
documented financial
Here is
problem.
the koku.
Samurai received a fixed rice
The
stipend
rice
from their
price
lord,
keeps
calculated
falling,
in a unit called
but my
koku,
stipend
rather than
doesn't
earning a
change.
flexible income tied to
I'm
actual
doomed.
economic conditions. As Japan's economy
Forgive
grew
my
increasingly
delay,
commercialized and money-based during the Edo
master.
period, and as rice prices fluctuated
Finally.
while a samurai's fixed stipend did not, many samurai families found themselves in genuine financial difficulty, asset-rich in social status,
Your
but frequently
debt
cash-poor in
is
practical terms,
paid.
sometimes to a startling degree. Historical and economic
Keep it
records from this era
safe.
describe samurai households accumulating significant debt to merchants, a socially awkward and, under Confucian-influenced class hierarchy, genuinely humiliating situation, since merchants technically occupied a
As
lower
you
formal
wish.
social rank than samurai despite frequently possessing far greater actual wealth. Some samurai families resorted to selling family heirlooms, taking on secretly disguised trade work considered beneath their official status, or arranging strategic marriages specifically to access merchant wealth, all while publicly maintaining the appearance of dignified samurai status that their code of conduct demanded. Beyond finances, your obligations extended to alternate attendance duty, a policy called senkenkotai, which required regional lords and significant portions of their samurai retainers to spend alternating periods of time in the shogun's capital at Edo, away from their home domains. This system, while politically effective at preventing regional lords from accumulating dangerous independent power, meant extended and expensive periods away from your own family, home, and land. Journeys and residencies that samurai households were expected to personally fund, adding yet another significant financial burden onto an already strained budget. And here's a detail that further complicates the warrior identity. Many samurai during this extended peace pursued serious scholarly, artistic, and cultural interests. Poetry, calligraphy, tea ceremony, painting, not merely as hobbies, but as genuinely valued markers of a cultivated, educated identity that Confucian-influenced samurai philosophy considered just as important as martial skill, if not more so, during eras when actual combat simply wasn't a realistic part of daily life. When conflict did occur, particularly during the intensely violent Sengoku period of the 15th and 16th centuries, before the Tokugawa peace, the actual dangers you faced diverged sharply from the noble, one-on-one duels popular imagination often assigns to samurai combat. Sengoku-era warfare frequently involved large-scale, coordinated battles featuring thousands of combatants, organized spear formations called as shigiri units composed largely of conscripted peasant soldiers, and, following the introduction of firearms, increasingly significant use of matchlock guns and coordinated volley formations. Individual samurai, even skilled ones, faced genuine risk from anonymous arrow fire, gunfire, and the simple chaos of mass battlefield combat. Dangers that had nothing to do with personal swordsmanship skill or individual honor, and everything to do with being in the wrong formation at the wrong moment. Injuries sustained in this kind of combat carried the same infection risks present in every pre-modern warfare context worldwide. Japanese medicine of this era, despite genuine sophistication in certain areas, had no concept of germ theory, and even minor wounds could become fatally infected in the days following a battle, meaning, as in medieval Europe, disease and infection likely claimed a significant number of lives that popular memory attributes entirely to direct combat. Beyond the battlefield, the social and legal consequences of samurai status carried their own genuine dangers. If your lord was defeated, disgraced, or had his domain confiscated by a rival or by the shogunate itself, you could become what was known as a ronin, a samurai without a lord, master, or stable income. Historical accounts describe ronin facing serious social stigma and genuine financial hardship, since samurai status without a lord's stipend meant no formal income at all, forcing many into poverty, itinerant work, or, in numerous documented cases, resorting to banditry or mercenary work simply to survive. A dramatic fall from formal social status that could happen through no direct fault of your own combat performance whatsoever. The samurai code also carried genuinely severe internal consequences for perceived failures of honor or loyalty. Seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, typically followed by a second person delivering a final, merciful killing strike, was formally institutionalized as an honorable alternative to execution or disgrace, available to samurai specifically because of their elevated social status. Far from being purely symbolic, historical records confirm seppuku was actually performed, sometimes voluntarily as an act of protest or loyalty, sometimes ordered as formal punishment following military defeat, political failure, or serious violations of the code of conduct governing samurai behavior. This meant that, unlike almost any other social class in feudal Japan, your own government and social code could, under specific circumstances, formally require you to end your own life as the honorable resolution to failure, a genuinely severe consequence with no real equivalent among the peasant or merchant classes you technically outranked. Here's a detail that surprises even people who've studied samurai history casually. The specific, highly codified concept of Bushido, often translated as the way of the warrior and popularly imagined as an ancient, unchanging samurai code of honor, is considerably more of a later construction than popular culture suggests. While concepts of loyalty, discipline, and martial honor genuinely existed throughout samurai history in various regional and period-specific forms, historians studying the topic note that Bushido as a single, formalized, philosophically systematic code was substantially shaped and popularized during the Meiji era of the late 19th century, well after the actual age of samurai warfare had largely ended, partly as a tool for building modern Japanese national identity and military ideology, during a period of rapid westernization and social change. This doesn't mean earlier samurai had no code of conduct at all. It means the specific, unified version many people picture today was, to a significant degree, retroactively systematized and romanticized generations after most of actual samurai history had already occurred. Women within samurai families, meanwhile, occupied a role considerably more complex than popular imagination typically acknowledges. While formal social and legal authority generally favored men, women of the samurai class were frequently trained in weapons used themselves, particularly the naginata, a polearm well suited to home defense, and were expected to manage household affairs, finances, and, during a husband's absence or death, sometimes significant estate responsibilities. Historical records document specific women who took direct, active roles defending family homes during periods of conflict, complicating the simplified, purely male warrior image of samurai society. The famous sword itself, treated with such reverence in popular culture, occupied a genuinely dual role in actual samurai daily life. A functional weapon during the relatively rare periods of active warfare, but for much of the class's later history, primarily a formal status symbol, a piece of family heritage, and a legally restricted marker of social rank, more often worn than drawn in anger across an average samurai's actual lifetime. By the time the Meiji government formally abolished the samurai class's special legal status in the 1870s, converting stipends into government bonds and eventually eliminating them entirely, many former samurai, accustomed to a rigid social hierarchy and a fixed income stipend system that had already been financially strained for generations, faced genuinely difficult economic transitions into a rapidly modernizing, increasingly commercial and industrial Japanese society. A final, quiet, distinctly unglamorous ending to a social class whose romanticized image would go on to considerably outlive the actual lived economic and social reality of most of the people who held that title. The samurai of popular imagination, masterful swordsman, unshakable warrior code, glorious battlefield death, was never entirely fictional. Elements of it genuinely existed, particularly during the most violent periods of Japanese history. But it was only ever part of the picture. The rest of the picture was childhood spent almost entirely on prescribed duty rather than personal choice. Centuries where your actual daily work looked more like government paperwork than swordplay. A fixed rice stipend that often left proud samurai families quietly drowning in debt to the merchants they were taught to consider beneath them. A formalized code that could, in specific circumstances, require you to end your own life as the honorable resolution to failure. And a way of the warrior, whose most famous, unified philosophical form was substantially shaped generations after most actual samurai had already lived and died. This was your life as a samurai, a role built as much around bureaucracy, financial strain, cultural refinement, and rigid social duty as around the sword, and considerably more complicated than a century of later romanticization ever gave it credit for. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which detail changed how you picture samurai history. And if you want to see what life actually looked like for the people samurai were sworn to govern and protect, that video is coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.